Hello everyone, it's Robert Evans and we are back with another episode of The Pixel Show. And today we're going to talk about what camera should I get. And today we're going to talk about the brand new A7S and shooting actually sports with it indoors. So we're going to talk about shooting swimming and dive. So here we go. So as I mentioned, we are going to talk about shooting the A7S, shooting swim and dive inside. And just as a reminder, what we try to do with something new that we've been doing, but with all our shows, you can click on the link. You can go into the galleries, you pick a particular image, you can click on it, you can see it better, and then to your left, if you click on photo details, then the XF data comes up, and you can see what camera, what lens, what aperture, what ISO, all those things that you might want to know. You click on show more and it gives you even more detail. But it's a really great way to get a better idea of what the imagery looks like as opposed to just watching it on the video. But before we do, if this is your first time seeing the Pixel Show, I would encourage you to go back and watch some of our previous episodes. We do all from talking about gear to sharing photo tips and stories of images. So the first thing is we talked about the new 21.8. There's an episode you might want to go back and watch with the holidays coming up on tips for great holiday cards. And there's a whole series that I did during this summer when we were all inside called The Stories Behind the Image, where I took about 70 or 80 of my favorite images. I divided them up about 10 images per show, and I tell some of the stories behind some of my favorite images over the last 30 years of my career. All right, so let's talk about this camera. Now, I am not going to get into all the specs and everything in the camera. I just want to talk about the highlights before we get going. So first of all, if you are curious about an A7S III or you'd buy that, one of the reasons you purchase this camera is for the incredible high ISO and low noise that this camera is capable of. So it goes up to all the way up to 409,600 and all the way down to 80 ISO. Comes with the Sony Bion sensor, which is pretty much 8 times more powerful and faster. So you can, if you want to do any more digging into that, I would suggest going on the Sony site and reading the specs. It's 12.1 megapixel. Now, as you've heard, a lot of videographers love this camera and want to use it for video because of the clean, and now it's 10-bit. But as a still camera, it's still quite amazing. I mean, for years before this camera came out and newer Sony cameras, I shot a lot of my weddings with the A7S II. A7S II, because I didn't care about the size of the file. A 12 megapixel image was fine because in wedding photography, most people are only going to order up to an 11 by 14. You know, maybe that's some of the bigger album sizes that I make. And even if they wanted a 30 by 40 wall portrait, that's still not a problem. And if you're concerned with that, then there's software out there like Topaz megapixel up where you can make your file sizes bigger. So it's something not to worry about and something that I had no problem with. So that's why I would use it for weddings and why I'm going to talk about using it for sports. Quickly again about the sensor or the processor, but this camera shoots 10 frames a second. Now, normally for sports, I have an A9 II and an A9, and I love those cameras. 20 frames a second is amazing, but depending on the sport that you're shooting, sometimes you don't need that speed. So again, we're going to talk about swim and dive here, 10 frames a second. That's pretty respectable, and it did the job that I needed it to do. And again, as far as the amount of focusing and the sensors, this camera has 759 phase detection points and 425 contrast detection points. And I found the focusing, being this was one of the first times that I shot this camera for sports, to be excellent. It tracked my subjects, it followed them. 95% of my images were in focus and stayed in focus, you know, through a dive or a swim. So I was really impressed by how well this camera performed. So again, I talked about this a little bit, but 10 frames a second really was more than enough to shoot swim and dive. So I think you need to determine A, what your lighting conditions are, and B, what the exact detail that you need to shoot. But again, at 10 frames a second, I'm shooting indoor, inside a pool with really bad lighting, which the images, as you will see, turned out beautiful. So the lenses that I use that you'll see across these images that I'm going to show you, the 135 1.8 G Master, the 70-200 G Master, and the 24-14 G Master. I take a lot of these with me to sports so that I have different focal lengths, and again, depending on what I'm shooting. I also have a 400-2.8, I have the 100-400, I have the 200-600. It depends on the sport that you're shooting on, depending on which lens you're going to want and you're going to want to need. But normally for inside a pool, the 70-200 is great. And the 135 1.8, some of you might be going, wow, that lens, but it's really fast, and I've really come to love that lens because of the 1.8. Again, inside, you combine a wide aperture lens with a camera that does amazing high ISO, and it's a great combination. But as you're gonna see, I actually really didn't need that high of an ISO. So all this stuff was shot at 6400, and what I try to do when I shoot anything really is I try to find my lowest ISO that I can get away with that will go with the shutter speed that I'm after. So usually for sports you want to be at least at 500th of a second to stop the action, and I kind of, with the swimming, I hovered between 500, 800, and 1000 to freeze that, sometimes more. So if your subject is moving faster, you want your shutter speed to be faster. But basically I go after the lowest ISO I can get away with to get the fastest shutter speed that I need. So here again, first opening shots, a good example. I wanted to show you two images of how quickly these images followed each other, right after each other, 10 frames a second, what it's going to accomplish. So as you can see, I don't know the time frame in between the two, but it's really pretty quick. Two great images that you can use. I also would like to say that also my determining factor of shooting this, and when you're choosing a camera to shoot a particular event. Now I'm shooting these images for the high school to use in their yearbooks and things like that. I'm shooting these images to share with the parents because of this year and COVID. Parents could not attend swim meets, so of course they live streamed them and we photographed them. I had really bad selection. I couldn't be on the deck to shoot, so I had to shoot from the stands in most cases, and it was difficult. But again, if you go back to the file size, 12 megapixel, again, it's a great file size for parents, for the high school, and some of this went to the local media to cover the high school. So these girls actually won, for all purposes, won state this year. They were undefeated in their season, swim and dive, and they won districts, or I guess it's districts and then sections, but there will be no state this year. But they had the best record, so technically they won state. All right, so with that said, let's go on. So again, I'm still using the 135 here. The 10 frames a second, shooting swimming, really I've come to find that, if you're gonna get a great image, I would prefer to shoot down a lane. So especially during breaststroke or butterfly. Sometimes shooting freestyle swimming is tough because you're going to just get a picture of them breathing. But in this case, this is breaststroke. But trying to catch a nice dramatic image. Now look at the color too. I was really impressed with this camera and the color. When I color correct, the lighting was crazy inside. And if I was shooting something in the pool, that was one type of lighting. If I was shooting stuff coming off the blocks, there were two other types of lighting. And it was really like back and forth. It's really bad lighting, but when I color correct, one of the important things to do, I use Capture One because I feel that it works better with Sony files. And I really just color correct so that the blacks are black and the whites are white, and everything else falls where it falls. I try to adjust the white balance a little bit so that they don't look too orange, too yellow. It looks like natural skin tones. But those are basically the three things that I'm going for. My blacks are black, my whites are white, and my skin tones don't look out of place. But I think it looks really great. Like I mentioned, I shot everything at 6400, and this is 12/50th of a second, wide open at 1.8. Now, when I shoot sports, and this is more of a composition or thought process. Yes, you want to shoot the action, but if you want to be a good sports photographer, there's more to shooting sport than just shooting the action. I always say you shoot the action, the reaction, and then the moments in between. And sometimes the moments in between, which this image is an example of, really like tell more of the meaningful stories, and of course mean more to the athletes and the parents that are going through. You know, these girls had such a challenge. Of course, everybody who got to play sports this year, if you were lucky enough to get to do that, you know, it was definitely different. And so they went through a lot, and you know, to catch fun moments like this and them sharing, you know, they had to wear face masks on the deck at all times. They could only take their masks off the second they got into the pool. They did their race, they put their mask on. I mean, that alone, you know, can't be fun. And so seeing them share moments and trying to capture images like this is also. Here's another swimming image. Again, we're still shooting with the 135. But again, look at the colors. Like, I'm really impressed with this camera. The quality of the imagery, you know, the sensor in this camera is really, really beautiful. And again, for anything that I would have to shoot inside sports-wise, whether it's swimming, volleyball, basketball, you know, any of those things, I'm gonna go to this camera and use the A7S III probably more times than not. And the only thing that would change that would be depending on what the images were for. For some reason, we needed you know, something with a bigger file size. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, part of shooting sports is not only the action, but shooting the reaction. And now I want to show you something here. Here, I'm still shooting the 135 on my camera. I happen to have my the A7S here. I happen to have the 12 to 24 in it. But on all the G Master lenses, on the side of the lenses, there's a button. And you can program this button to whatever you want. So I program my cameras to be on the APS-C or Super 35 mode. And what that does is it gives you a little more reach from your lens. So let's take the 135 that I shot that image with. So it's a 135 lens, and I pushed Super 35 so that I could zoom in. It's about a 1.5 crop factor, which 1.5 times 135 is roughly 202.5. So for all practical purposes, I'm getting a 200 millimeter lens now instead of my 135. It's a really easy way, instead of switching lenses, to just get in a little bit closer and to shoot reaction stuff like that. The other thing now that you have to consider is now you're taking your 12 megapixel sensor. When you use the Super 35 crop mode, you're gonna use a smaller part of your sensor. So if this is full frame and you switch to Super 35, then it goes to this. I don't know the calculation on what that is, but let's just say if you're going from a 12 megapixel file, and let's say it just cuts it in half, which that's not the exact calculation, and you're now down to 6 megapixel, that's still a great file size. You can still, again, you can use something like Topaz software, AI software, and up-res your files. But again, something that's going to the parents, the papers, or for the high school to use. As you can see, this is a really great image. And don't forget, like I told you in the front of the show, there's a link where you can go to a gallery and you can view all these images. So again, you can look at the images on the computer, you can examine them closer, you can look at all the XF data. I use Smug Gallery, so it's really easy to use. So now let's move on to diving. So here's some dive images, and we're also switching lenses. So a lot of times with dive, it's you know, depends on where you get to be. So this was the Sections Dive Championship, and I got a really great spot because the bleachers happened to be right beside the diving tank, so it was really great. Now this particular image, again, talking about the reaction, I was sitting there shooting diving for 2.5 hours roughly by the time 8 schools dove and so forth. And the way these images came about is I kind of was bored. I mean, to be honest, I'm sitting there and shooting girls flipping around. It's not that difficult. And so then I was like playing games like, well, what other images could I take? Again, thinking about the reaction. And I started noticing all these girls, you know, the first breath that they take when they come out of their dive. And some of them are happy, some of them are sad, and some of them are excited. And so I started playing this game of shooting the girls' reactions when they came out of the water. So I had to be kind of quick. I had to like shoot the dive and then, you know, wait for them to come up, kind of guess where they were coming up in the water, and hoped that they were facing me. So out of all the images that I shot, I got 2 or 3 really good ones, but was my favorite one. Again, we're at 6,400. This was on a different day. 800 shutter speed at a 2-point aperture, which is the widest that the 70-200 G Master will go. Okay, so here is dive. Those are the judges sitting in the background. Let me let you see it bigger. And, you know, I kind of came to find out after shooting dive for a little while that I really like the images with twists in them because I think it was the most flattering on the divers. You know, overall, that was my preference. But again, shooting these girls coming off the board, the type of focusing that I was using tracking focus in a zone. And I'd set the tracker spot on the girl, you know, right as she was walking down the board, or sometimes they stand at the end of the board. And then I would just shoot as they go to do their dive, 10 frames a second. You know, I'd fire off 10, 12 images, whatever it ended up being in the process of the dive. And most of the images that you're going to like, or that I liked, were within the first, you know, 5 or 6 images of the dive. Let's say I shot 10 frames. But it did a really good job of just staying focused on the athlete and keeping nice separation from the judges in the background, because it could easily grab onto the judges in the background and focus on them. And 1 or 2 times that it did that, but I was really impressed on how well it stayed on the actual athlete. Okay, here's another dive. This is the girl that actually won this particular dive competition. But again, nice separation, even at 2.8 between the diver and the judges, and just, you know, freezing the action. I'm at 1,000th of a second here. You know, they're doing flips and twists, and it works out really well. One more twist. Now, I liked this image. I liked that this girl was from a different school, of course. Their colors were red. And I sort of like that the judge had red on in the background. She's probably even their coach, because a lot of the coaches get to do the scoring. There's a lottery, and the different, you know, 5 or 6 of the coaches from 8 schools get to actually do the judging. But again, flattering. You see how nice and sharp the focus is on her face and the reaction. And again, go into the gallery or the link and you can see these images up close. But really like this image. And now this is the final image, and we've now switched to the 24-1-4. So this particular image was at the end of the section meets, and these girls were the seniors from this high school, and they this was their last meet. They won sections, and like I mentioned at the top of the show, for all practical purposes, they won state. And this is this girl's last time to swim, so this is a tradition, and they wanted to all jump in the pool together, so we did that. And again, 10 frames a second. I caught the whole process of this dive, but to me, this was the best image. This was the highest point that they jumped. I got down low so that I could get their reflection in the pool. I wanted to make sure that I included the name of their high school and their logo, and you know, this is probably one of the girls' and the parents' favorite images. So that's it. I wanted you just to see some images from the A7S III. Again, go to the gallery, look at the images in the gallery. You can see them closer. You can look to see how clean and free of, even at 6,400, noise that these files are. I appreciate you watching. I'm Robert Evans, and thank you for watching The Pixel Show.